Everyone, and welcome to the Osterville Village Library. We're delighted to have you with us for what promises to be a fascinating journey into a beloved chapter of New England history. Today, we are honored to welcome acclaimed author and historian Anthony Sammarco, whose engaging presentations and extensive knowledge have made him one of the region's most respected voices on Boston's rich past. This afternoon, Anthony will transport us back to the golden age of Revere Beach, Wonderland, once known as the largest amusement park in New England. Through historic photographs, captivating stories, and remarkable insights, we'll revisit an era of dazzling lights, thrilling rides, lively entertainment, and cherished summer memories that drew visitors from across the region. Without further ado, Anthony Sammarco.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming out on such a hot, sunny day. But Revere Beach Wonderland is a lecture that I put together, and I'm just going to ask, has anybody ever gone to Revere Beach? It was a place of most people in Boston in the 20th century that either you went to the beach or the amusements, or you even went to see the venues. The whole concept is it's totally different than what I normally do. As we all know, my recent books are The History of the Christmas Tree Shops, S.S. Pierce. I'm writing right now, Wednesday is Prince Spaghetti Day, and I'm actually going to be doing a book on Filene's and Filene's Basement. These are fun. And in retirement, I had a financial career and I taught at Boston University. These are things in some ways that I explore for months on end before I begin to write. And it's surprising when I post things on Facebook and people might comment upon it, some of these comments even get into the books. Well, Revere Beach Wonderland is a wonderful place that really didn't only start until the late 19th century. And see on the cover, it's the entrance to Wonderland. Now, Wonderland today is perpetuated in the name of Wonderland, which is a stop on the blue line of the MBTA. But in the early part of the 20th century, this was the prototype for Disney World, and it would actually transform what we thought of for amusements. Well, Revere Beach is considered the people's beach. Revere Beach has attracted people from all over the state, including families, vacationers, and people from all walks of life. Revere Beach is perfectly located close to Boston and surrounding cities and conveniently on major roads leading in and out of the city. On October 1st of 1896, the Metropolitan Park Commission assumed control of the beach and began to develop it with bathing facilities as well as an amusement strip facing the ocean. Now, in that instance, you began to realize this was something that had been there for time immemorial, and it was known in the 17th and 18th century, mostly for fisheries. But by the latter part of the 19th century, people began to go to the beach, not so much to bathe, but in this postcard from 1890, fully dressed with hats and either walking or in horse-drawn carriages. And this was something that would subtly change. And by the 1890s, one man changed it, and that was Charles Eliot. Eliot was the son of President Eliot of Harvard. He had graduated from Harvard and trained under the supervision of Frederick Law Olmsted, whose works included New York Central Park and the grounds of the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. Eliot stated in November of 1896 that we, quote, "we must not conceal from visitors the long sweep of the open beach, which is the finest thing about the reservation," unquote. Now, we don't think of a beach as a reservation, but Eliot was instrumental in creating and perpetuating the emerald necklace that went throughout not only the surrounding area of Boston, but included the Commonwealth Avenue Mall and the Fenway. This was part of the concept of preserving land. Charles Eliot designed a broad boulevard on the old railroad bed, and on the beach side, he placed a series of simple but elegant pavilions and a bandstand. A parking pavilion could accommodate 1,000 bicycles, and tunnels led from the beach under the boulevard to an elaborate bathhouse with changing rooms for 1,000 bathers. The Metropolitan Park Commission had a monopoly on bathing suits at Revere Beach. Bathers were required to rent their suits at the bathhouse, and bathers were required to rent their suits at the bathhouse, and the reservation manufactured, repaired, and laundered them as well. And the on-site laundry could wash, wring, and press 500 bathing suits an hour. So it was a regulation, and you couldn't bathe in your own clothes. Well, here, in a postcard of the early 20th century, we saw people bathing in the ocean with their regulation bathing outfits. But there was also a clock on the boulevard to remind beachgoers that their rented bathing suits were only for 1 hour. And this was something that if you went over 1 minute, you had to pay for 2 hours to actually pay for your suit. It was a great example in some ways of transforming Revere, which had been only really developed in the mid to late 19th century by a man named Alpheus Purley Blake. Blake had created the town of Hyde Park, which is now a neighborhood of the city of Boston. And he bought land in Revere and began to lay out new streets that would actually attract people to build a house. Well, it was accessible from East Boston, and it was called the Boston Revere Beach and Lynn Railway, and it was the largest single factor in the development and growth of Revere. It was popularly known as the Narrow Gauge Railroad. It operated from Lynn to East Boston, and prior to 1896, its roadbed followed a path that traced the crescent shape of the coastline. The train operated along Railroad Avenue, which is today named Revere Beach Boulevard, and it was then removed and relocated 400 feet to the west. The MBTA currently runs its Blue Line along the same roadbed. And in its heyday, passengers would patronize the train from stations all along the resort area. The Point of Pines, Oak Island, Revere Street, and the Bathhouse stations were just a few. They call it the narrow gauge because it was a narrower gauge than every other railroad. And it was something that brought people primarily from East Boston to Lynn, which was a huge shoe development town. So we saw it not only was for enjoyment, but also for business. Revere Beach Reservation was the first ocean beach in the United States, and it was acquired for the public in one ways, the first properties to be added to Boston's Metropolitan Park system. In 1895, the time of its acquisition, Revere Beach was a seaside resort and becoming overdeveloped. On the left, we see the bathhouse, where people would actually rent their bathing suits. They had cabanas for 1,000 people. And on the right of that photograph are the shelters. And these shelters were designed by a man named Ernest Wadsworth Longfellow. He was a cousin of the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. But his claim to fame is he designed the elevated railway that connected Sullivan Station and Forest Hills in Jamaica Plain. In that instance, what was created was a resort, but in a different way than we might have enjoyed it in the 20th century and the 21st century. People did come by train. There was also a ferry from Rose Wharf, and people would sit along the wall or under the shelters or listen to the band in the bandstand. And as you can see here, many people came in street clothing. They might have an umbrella or a parasol, but the whole concept was a day at the ocean. And of course, ocean air was always thought bracing and very good for the health. But during that period, you began to realize Revere Beach and the boulevard would change subtly. In 1895, the Massachusetts legislature ordered that nearly 3 miles of the seacoast land, or what is now the Revere Beach Reservation, and the Metropolitan Park Commission was entrusted with the land in 1896. Charles Eliot would transform it from what we see on the left-hand side as an entire boulevard of wood frame buildings into what really became the place of entertainment. People looked at this as not just a town, Revere is today a city, but as a town that had people living there throughout the season. But it was also something that had thousands of people that came on a weekly basis. Well, in these photographs, one black and white and one as a colored postcard, you began to see these buildings. These were houses, lodging houses, boarding houses. You might stay a day, you might stay a week, or maybe even a month. But the concept here was, not only was it ocean air, but you also had fish and shellfish dinners all along with different restaurants, pubs, and even bar rooms. And it was important because in the evening, they had these huge canopies of metal that were having electric light bulbs. So it was almost magical in the evening. Well, from the early 1900s, Revere was well known for its fine Oh, you have it too. Yeah, I'm always losing my wordage because it's covered. Find places of entertainment. And these included the Ocean Ballroom, Beechcroft, Nautical Gardens, the Frolic, Wonderland, and the Ocean View Ballroom. Many people will also remember the Crescent Garden Ballroom, Spanish Gables, and the Moorish Castle. And among the famous bands and musicians that performed for dancing were Paul Whiteman, Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey, Guy Lombardo, Louis Prima, and others. And during the 1930s, dance marathons were held at Revere Beach, and couples would dance for 45 minutes of every hour from June until October until the end of the contest. It was not uncommon to see people dancing for more than 1,800 hours, and prizes would be awarded to winners, sometimes more than $2,000. The Great Depression in the 1930s was something that many people did not have a job. Dancing was something that was not only enjoyable, probably not after 1,800 hours, but it was also something that you possibly could win $2,000. In 21st century, $2,000 translates to $25,000. It could have actually made a family's life much more easy. But people might go to the nautical gardens on the left-hand side. And of course, dancing to a band was not only enjoyable, but it brought hundreds to watch. Well, by 1910, postcards were being sent, greetings from Revere Beach, and the woman in the center has now become a butterfly. Her wings show the bathing suits and the bathing scene, as well as the bandstand and the Revere Beach Reservation. This was something for a penny you could send to family and friends, wish you were here. And of course, it was something that was becoming more and more popular as years went on. Well, some of the postcards show things that if this was my daughter, I would have broken her legs. Standing on the railing of a place that went out to the pavilion, you see that she's holding a lamppost, and the photograph in some ways shows not only her in a bathing suit, but how fun it was. But some of them had a little bit of a historical context, such as this, a morning smile at Revere Beach. Well, this is actually somewhat of a photograph that replicates the bronze statue of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. You might know this in Copenhagen. It's actually the Bronze Maiden of Langenlein. And the poem is, upon the stone where breakers white roll softly in the Baltic light, she sits enshrined in quiet bronze, a heart of myth that yearns and longs. No crown of gold, no heavy stone, no salt and spray and moss-grown bone, a quiet maid of wave and pine, cast out upon Langeline. And this is something in some ways, I don't know if they realized it when they did the postcard. Many of these were Germanly produced, but it was a great example to see how much people were enjoying it. By 1910, it was something that at least half of the people were now going to the beach, and they were bathing. And Revere Beach has always offered great swimming, sunbathing, fishing, and boating. But on the upper right-hand side, by the 1920s, they were no longer regulated, and many people wore their own bathing suits. These are a little bit intriguing, but the whole concept was it was now not a regulation. Well, bathers tired of sand and sun might visit the amusements along the boardwalk. At Wonderland, which was called the self-contained amusement park, they could ride early roller coasters such as the Virginia Reel, the Wild Mouse, or if they were brave, the Cyclone. Dance halls were another attraction, especially during the Depression when dance marathons were regular fare at the Ocean View and Wonderland ballrooms. On the left, you actually see the wonderful pavilion projecting from the harbor. This was a walkway that was over 200 feet long, and of course it was lit by electric lights in the evening. But in the foreground, you see the bathers along with the beginning of automobiles, and that really subtly changed Revere Beach in the 1930s and 1940s. But one area in Revere that was called Wonderland was something that was touted as the Coney Island of the East. And the Wonderland Amusement Park operated only between 1906 and 1910 in Revere, featuring various roller coasters, rides, and exhibits. But the park continued to decline, possibly because so much of the park had to be shuttered during the winter months. but also because it was not directly on Revere Beach, it was losing business to attractions along the boulevard. Wonderland was the prototype for Disneyland. Now, this was something that you paid a small admission, and then you would go in and see a variety of attractions as well as rides. Well, Wonderland was built on 25 acres of swampland. And because of the success of Revere Beach Boulevard, three men worked together to create it. John Higgins, a commercial real estate broker, and Floyd Thompson, a visionary with interest in amusement parks, combined their talents to create Wonderland. Now, directly below, this is one admission to Wonderland. It cost 25 cents. Sounds like a small amount of money, but it was something in some ways. If you had an entire family, it could have been quite costly. But the whole concept was, during this time, this was really one of the most popular places, not just in Revere, but in the metropolitan Boston area. Wonderland did fail in 1911 and eventually opened to Wonderland Dog Track in 1935. Today, it's being developed for mixed housing. But during that period, people might come to Wonderland and to enjoy, as I said, the Coney Island of the East, Revere Beach. It boasted rides, dance halls, theaters, carousels, roller coasters, and all kinds of attractions. Some of them were Bluebeard's Palace, Nautical Gardens, the Pit, and the Himalaya, with just a few. This postcard is Shoot the Chutes, and it was a ride that was a light skiff drawn up a long ramp to a tower at the top, and then released with a lubricating base of water. The boat would achieve such a high speed sliding down the ramp that it would skip across the surface of the lagoon like a stone. Now, when you realize in that instance, everybody was drenched, but it was supposedly fun. But this was something in some ways that you began to realize these different amusements, in some ways, became tremendously popular. There was the bewitching Orient. Now, this building was a prototype Moorish building. It had minarets and some wonderful bronze caps. It actually was something that it showed in a display of different things within the interior. It was like a sultan's palace. And many people had never really traveled to the Middle East or even to Turkey, but they began to realize that the architecture did at least give credence to the aspect of the Orient, but you also began to see things such as the Japanese village. Now, local girls who were employed would dress in Japanese costumes, and they showcased the Japanese village, a recreation of the interior of a Japanese home within a replica of Mount Fuji. Now, the postcard is fun. Many of the buildings did have a Japanese architectural theme, and in the background, you do see a recreation of Mount Fuji. But here, you began to realize with a kimono and, of course, a parasol, many of these young girls would work in such a way as to attract the public into the village. Now, one of the aspects is there was a waterway through Wonderland. And in the Japanese village, they created a royal arch. It was simply an arch over the waterway, and you would walk up and over it. It did nothing. But if you had your photograph taken there, it was a great souvenir of visiting Wonderland. This postcard dated to about 1907. You see adults, young children, and even babies actually being carried across. But one of the ones was called the Human Laundry. Now, I'm sure we'd all want to visit this. This was a playful, disorientating walk through a funhouse or illusion-based laugh factory, where patrons were put through a humorous mechanical stimulation of being put through a laundry wash cycle using rotating barrels, air jets, or sliding apparatus. You entered and you left soaking wet. But the Human Laundry was a great bit of fun. They also had this. Gordon William Lilly was known professionally as Pawnee Bill, and he was an American showman and performer who specialized in the Great Wild West Show, which was a major attraction featured at the Wonderland Amusement Park on Revere Beach. He was a cowboy. And seen here in the season of 1908, Pawnee Bill is depicted in this trade card, but you see his Wild West Show didn't have just cowboys, it had Native Americans, it had horses, and it would recreate some of the battles that was created at Sioux City. These were fun. People loved it. But I think one of the most famous was the Revere Beach volcano. Can you imagine? Not just Mount Fuji, but there was a volcano. And the famed volcano was erected in the summer of 1906 for Carnival Week. Located on Revere Beach opposite the Nautical Gardens, you can see that on the right-hand side of the slide, this was a papier-mâché volcano, and it was fired up and depicted the eruption of Mount Vesuvius for visitors. In effect, it was an illumination with smoke and noise and spewed forth pre-stamped souvenir postcards to send to family and friends. No longer did we have lava, but as you can see, the little bits of dark were postcards that were pre-stamped of the volcano. And if you grabbed them and wrote home to family and friends, what a great story for a dinner party. Well, I think the one that I always thought of as really the most outre was Fighting the Flames. This was the most impressive show at Wonderland and was the Fighting of the Flames show. There was a grandstand that could hold 3,500 people for the show that would be stuffed with flammable material and set on fire twice daily. They hired actors to put on a little street scene. And to fight the fire, they hired retired or moonlighting firemen to man actual newly purchased state-of-the-art fire engines and rescue equipment. Acrobats performed jumps into nets and climbed down ladders, dressed as ordinary people. So if you can imagine burning this down twice daily, 7 days a week, you can imagine 3,500 people watching this. Incredible. Well, the whole concept was Wonderland was a great attraction, but it failed. But along Revere Beach Boulevard, it was developed even in the early part of the 20th century, but its heyday was really coming to be the 30s and 40s. Here was the Nautical Gardens. This was a place that looked like Union Station, which was on Causeway Street in North Station. The building that was replaced by the present-day Boston Garden almost replicates it. And as you see, this was something that had windows on both sides, so the cooling air of the ocean could go through the building. Dancing was popular, dining, and even ice cream. But the idea here was, along the boulevard, many of the wonderful amusements that had been at Wonderland began to be replicated along the boulevard. And this was the Derby Racer. Now, the Derby Racer were these little individual cars that were actually hooked like a roller coaster onto a mechanical base, and they would be driven all around on a figure eight or up and down. Children loved it, but as you entered, look at the face of the devil above the door. It was basically not only something that was fun, but it was a little bit mysterious. Of course, people looked at this for a few cents as a few minutes of entertainment. But it was also something, as you see here, it would have been just to the left. The advertisement said Revere Beach on Sunday, the Boston and Maine Railroad. Of course, that went through Revere as well, going to Maine. People could come either by the narrow gauge, the Boston and Maine, by foot, by car, but they would come. Now, one of the things was Trask's was a dining room that actually served very good fish and shellfish. It had been located on Revere Beach since the 1870s. And this rendition is something that shows it directly below the Derby Racer. And it remained there until the 1940s. So it wasn't just the fact that you could take a ride, but you could also have a fairly good meal. One place that I remember was the Hippodrome. And it was originally built with a platform that displayed 3 carousel horses abreast. And it was later extended to 5 abreast, making it one of a kind in the United States. The organ music of the 2 Gavioli organs can still be heard with the memory of this majestic carousel, which operated until May of 1973. Wonderland Park, Revere Beach's Mystic City by the Sea, was America's foremost self-contained amusement park. And conceived in 1905, it opened in 1906. And some people believe it to be the inspiration behind the Disney theme parks of today. So this merry-go-round, or the Hippodrome, was originally at Wonderland, but then moved to the boulevard. And these horses were carved wood, beautifully polychromed. But it was something that not only could you sit on the horses that went up and down and went in a circle, or even in carriages. Great fun. One of the more outre displays was an infant incubator with live infants. This was exhibited before incubators were standard in traditional hospitals. Public exhibitions used admission fees from fairgoers to fund round-the-clock specialized nursing, warm air circulation, and proper medical care for fragile infants. Had anybody ever heard of this exhibit? Well, in the latter part of the 19th century, the Floating Hospital in Boston was a major hospital that offered great medical attention for inner city children. Because of the areas of the West End, the South End, and of course, even the North End, these areas were close. And of course, children sometimes had no air. They would be brought onto the ship, clean sheets. Of course, they would be bathed, and they would go out into the ocean, which had not only cooling air, but they had the attention of doctors and nurses. Infants that needed an incubator very rarely survived. And in this instance, these were things that were not only here in Revere, but in Coney Island and even in the Palisades in New Jersey. It was something that had money that would eventually raised by the admission charge to hopefully keep these children in their oxygen tents to keep breathing. But if you were going, maybe you get some popcorn to watch the children breathe. Well, the bathing aspect of the 1930s came full force. Remember, nobody needed to wear regulation bathing suits anymore. Now you needed lifeguards, and these young men, sometimes high school or college young men, would actually be posted along the beach in case of need. And people saw this as something that not only was free of charge, you could bring a lunch or a dinner and bathe at the beach, but there was also free entertainment. During the summer months, young girls would actually be hired to do these peekaboo dances. They would go up and down the beach, and of course, this was Revere's aspect to the Rockettes in New York. And they were something in some ways that continued right up through the time of World War II. But many people looked at this as something that would really have changed. And seen here in 1875 on the right-hand side, we would go the gamut, almost every generation, so to speak, of women's bathing attire. I love the 1875. She's covered from the toes all the way to the head. The 1890 looks like she escaped from prison. The 1900, well, she's still got something short, but if you notice, she has bloomers on. 1925 blew everything. And by 1927, they were dressing for the beach. This is something in some ways within a very short period of time of 50 years that now show that bathing at public beaches had become something that many people did, whereas in 1875, it was very rare. In the nighttime, the area along the boulevard was magical. Now, I always remember when I saw strobe lights in the air, I would always think it must be something really gala. What's going on? We were stuck in Green Harbor in the summer. We would be driven from Dorchester to Green Harbor, and of course, brought back on Labor Day. And we would sit there sometimes and see strobe lights. We had no idea what they were. But here at Revere Beach, not only did you have electric lights on these arches over the streets, but the strobe lights for people coming to Revere Beach realized there were dances, there were dining rooms, and of course, there were places to have a drink. But here, pier dancing pavilion by moonlight is something that's really quite wonderful. This is the projecting bridge, 200 feet in length and electric lights that brought you for dancing. Now, this was not only with electric lights on the interior, the entire exterior was actually lined with electric lights. So bright neon lights flash in the night. Crowds walk fast along the wide wall. Laughter and music drift from the past, and old roller coasters live in our dreams. This was something that, again, did show they were professional dancers that did exhibitions, but everybody would be encouraged to join the dance for money. One of the attractions was Bluebeard's Castle, and this was a popular attraction along Revere Beach during the heyday of the amusement park era. It was designed as a spooky stone fortress inspired by the old French folklore of Bluebeard. Inside were crooked hallways, dark passages, spinning floors, and a classic funhouse effect. Does anybody remember the story of Bluebeard? It was really quite interesting. Bluebeard marries a young woman and removes her to his opulent estate. He leaves his bride with a set of keys that will open every room in the mansion. The only restriction is the room behind a small door at the end of a long hall on the ground floor. This room was reserved for him. She finally gets a key, enters, and she finds his 6 previous wives dead. So Bluebeard was somebody who was not only a philanderer, but he was also somebody in some ways that created this spooky image. And there was the descent into Hellgate. And this ride took passengers on a boat through a spiral track towards a center point where it dropped suddenly down into a lower level. The lower level was decorated as a cave, populated by demons and mythological creatures. The riders disembarked and were brought to the throne of Satan himself before emerging back into the sunlight. It must have been frightening for young people. But again, it was frightening but thrilling. And seen here by the 1930s, no longer were there parking for 1,000 bicycles, there was hodgepodge parking for 1,000 automobiles. As you see, there's no rhyme nor reason. Kind of looks like the Back Bay. In that instance, we see people all along the beach, but these cars go up and down, and they create, in some ways, something that's very dangerous. Notice the ones on the right-hand side parked on the sand of the beach. They hope they get out. And of course, in a photograph here of the 1950s, this was something on the upper left-hand side that you see all of these amusements and the thousands of people that came for a day at the beach. It was something that during the Depression, many people realized it was a fun day. I know people that would have brought entire pots of pasta and ate the pasta at the beach. I remember one time we went, I had a great uncle that lived at Point of Pines. His house faced the ocean, and we were treated to Kentucky Fried Chicken, which was a totally new aspect in 1966. But you realize this was something that people enjoyed. Of course, getting a tan, but it was also the fact of the cooling ocean. And for more than a century, every year from Easter time to Labor Day, visitors from all over were entertained at Revere Beach. In the early years, they walked, bicycles, or took horse-drawn carriages. Later on, it was convenient to reach via the narrow gauge, automobile, and thousands would come by ferry. It was said that, quote, Revere Beach was the place to go to be entertained, have fun, or just relax and enjoy a day at the beach, unquote. And in the photograph on the left, you can see that by the period of 1945 to 1950, they now had parking lots. And this was something that allowed the cars to park on a diagonal to get more cars in. But it was also something on macadam. No longer do people get stuck in sand. Some of the rides were incredible. And this was the Lightning roller coaster. This was the idea of Harry Davis and Harry Travis, both accomplished coaster designers. The all-steel coaster was the most terrifying of its time. It was 75 feet in height. The only straight and level track along the ride was at the station when you got on or got off. And its steep grades and bank curves made it the most unique coaster in the world. It was thrilling, but of course, adults and children were usually petrified as it went on a 75-foot decline before it rose to the other piece. And roller coasters thrilled amusement park goers, and we realized that this was not only the Tickler, the Thunderbolt, Derby Racer, and the Jackrabbit were 4. Dragon Gorge and the Thompson Scenic Railway were also early favorites. And 2 of the most famous on Revere Beach were the Lightning roller coaster and the Cyclone. The Lightning roller coaster was 100 feet in height, and it was the biggest one on the east coast of the United States. And you can see in the photograph on the lower right, it would have at least 12 to 15 people, and you can imagine the screams as people enjoyed the ride. Now, one of the things about Revere Beach was it wasn't just a place of entertainment, and we might have a few coins in our pocket. We'd have coins for a ride, or maybe an ice cream cone. But seen here, the Great White Way was now showing it in such a way that it said, where can you win a house and lot for a dime? Every week they would have a lottery and the dimes would mount. And those dimes would actually provide a person, if they won, a lot of land in Revere and a house. Now, for a dime, that wasn't a bad thing. Of course, the house, some of them do exist a little bit further back towards what is 1A. They're 4 rooms or a very small lot of land, but it was still a house. So many people began to realize that simple lottery might make them a winner. Of course, tonight we have what, $750 million on Powerball? I stopped to get 2 tickets. I never play the lottery. Maybe I'll win. And of course, people came for dancing. Now, early on, we saw that many people did this during the Depression for a dance competition. But there were places like the Driftwood, Harry Chef's, the General Edwards Inn, the Skipper, I can't read that, but the Short Side and the Paul Roger House all featured the finest in seafood. Fast food outlets included Joe and Nemo's, Howard Johnson's, Rudolph's, Pepper Steak, Danny's, and of course the world-famous Kelly's Roast Beef. Now, seen here was the Parkway, a modern building. It did serve lobster dinners for $1.75, but it was air conditioned. And it was a lovely evening. There was a band, there were singers, and seen here on the shore side, the same concept. This was bringing fairly important talent to Revere Beach to entertain the public. Now, of course, some people insist that Kelly's roast beef is the finest sandwich in Boston. Now, I've always said I'd like to try it once they cook it because it's always served rare. And seen here on the right-hand side, the woman's hand holds it. It looks delicious, but I've never seen pink meat on my table. Kelly's is something that is still actually providing roast beef, but they also provide fried clam strips, fried clams, fried chicken, hot dogs, hamburgers, but they're well known for their roast beef. And of course, there was Rudolph's Pepper Steaks, and Rudolph's had been on the boulevard since 1905. They did sell, of course, pepper steak, which is delicious, clam, shrimp, onion rings, French fries, all the things we're told not to eat, but for that afternoon are just simply wonderful. But you realize in this painting how many people came. Seniors, adults, young adults, children, and even babies and perambulators. This was something that attracted the public. Now, yes, ice cream and frozen custard is wonderful, but one of the things that was served was snowballs. Now, I'm half Italian, and we always got a slush at my cousin Maria Pocari's store in the North End. It was lemon, delicious, out of a wooden barrel, probably had salmonella for all I know. But snowballs were ground ice, and you could have orange, grape, or cherry syrup put over the top. Not only refreshing, but delicious. And it was a little bit different than the typical things of creamery. And of course, the places people went. Well, many might remember the Frolic nightclub, where some of the country's most famous singers and comedians performed. Barbra Streisand, Jimmy Durante, Paul Anka, and Jerry Vale were among the many who got their start here. The Frolic attracted great publicity, and it also hired many people who were beginning to rise in their careers. So if you can imagine Barbra Streisand singing here, it was something that brought hundreds. These were really places that were fun. And the Frolic, as you see here, didn't just serve fine food and fine libations, but it was along a strip that included these arcades. Now, maybe you actually went to the arcade and threw a ball to try and win something. You see on the left-hand side, 3-foot-tall poodles in different colors. Of course, they were wonderful to win. Then a week later, you wondered why you won it. But seen here is a man being hugged by a monkey with a top hat. Look at the monkeys. It says 3 balls for $1 or 1 ball for 50 cents. Well, in that instance, if you threw the ball and it actually went into the hat with the star on the top of the top hat, you would win your monkey. No child could not resist throwing those balls, but they were fun. And you also see here the Cyclone roller coaster. It was world famous. And in 1925, it cost $125,000 to build. Now, $125,000 in 1925, 100 years later, would be about $2 million. This all-wood coaster was built by Harry Travers, the same man that developed earlier roller coasters. Its first vertical drop was 100 feet, and riders experienced the thrill, or the sheer terror, of the ride at speeds of 45 to 50 miles per hour. It was the world's fastest and longest coaster, measuring 3,600 feet of track. But it wasn't cheap. The coaster cost 40 cents for one ride, which was a good sum of money, whereas everything else was a dime to 25 cents. But it really was huge. And seen here, it loomed over the beach. This remained right through to the end. But people might spend an afternoon at the beach, have something to eat, and possibly do the amusement rides with their children. Now, in some ways, some of them were very genteel. And this Ferris wheel, I love this artistic photograph of the tattooed man with the W, with his child on his shoulders in the center of the wheel. It would go very gently as you went around, and people still saw as much as they did without the terror of the 50-mile-per-hour roller coaster. But the amusement park would close in 1978, and Revere Beach, often referred to as the Coney Island of Massachusetts, was also the playground of New England. And here we see a cement wall that actually divided the beach from the boulevard, and many of the places that not only survived, but had become somewhat honky-tonk. But it was to be reinvented. And we realized in Revere Beach, in that period of the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, that yes, people could still drive to the ocean, park on the boulevard, either walk or enjoy a day in the sun. But by the period of the latter part of the 20th century, Revere Beach was now being marketed as a place for people of all walks of life. The amusements were all gone at this point. But it says, cool blue waves roll on in sun. Soft gray sands wait for the sun. Gulls fly high in the salty wind. Footprints wash clean with tide. And seen on the left-hand side, and this is a photograph from 1995, it does have not only adults and children, but you see on the right-hand side, I love it, two elderly gentlemen with their trousers rolled up and their hats as they walk along the beach, obviously with Italian bread in a brown paper bag under their shoulder. And on the lower portion, what had become, in some ways, Muscle City. Every young man had muscles and a tan beyond belief. But with their girlfriends, it was something that was a great attraction. And of course, partly safe. But by that period, the beach in this instance was something that people were bringing beach chairs, blankets, and of course, their food. And this is a great photograph to realize in some ways how really fun it was. Beach was dredged daily. Of course, we realized not only rocks and strips of seaweed, different shells would gather, but it would be cleaned in such a way that it was something that attracted people 7 days a week. But during that period, you realized the shelters and the bandstand survived. There was no longer any band. You see in the distance, there are no longer any amusements. But you see people still enjoying the beach because, of course, it is something on a hot summer day. It's not only refreshing, but it's a destination. And by the turn of the 21st century, we began to realize groups like the Sons of Italy would begin to actually sponsor bocce tournaments on Revere Beach, which are done to this day. People would actually play. It was an Italian game, but the whole concept was you'd have hundreds of people enjoying bocce. And you also began to realize they wanted to do the International Sand Sculpting Festival at Revere Beach. What better place? It's sand. It actually came through the innovation of doing carved ice sculptures at Copley Square for first night. They were something that attracted people in the freezing cold to look at all of these different carved ice sculptures. Now, the Revere Beach Sand Festival was something that people would actually do in a place that had completely changed. I just want you to look on the upper left-hand side of the photograph. Do you see the high rises? This is how Revere Beach was subtly changing. It was now luxury condominiums, luxury apartments, middle class, as well as subsidized. And you realized it was truly becoming a neighborhood now, no longer just a place of amusement. But the sandcastle and the sculptures were incredible. Yarmouth has it every year. It's always intriguing to see them. They're fun, but I love this one. Look on the left, the dome of the Massachusetts State House. You see Miguel Rosales' um, uh, Zakim Bridge, Paul Revere and his horse Meg on the Midnight Ride, Old North Church, the Gloucester Fisherman, a lighthouse. You realize it is truly the Massachusetts history. It's fun, but it's not only old history, it's new history. And that is something that was 20 feet in height. Now, I don't know about you. I had a little plastic tub that had crenellated towers, and I'd make little towers on the beach. They were no more than 8 inches. But can you imagine doing this? And actually, people won a competition, and they won a little bit of money. This was Mr. Monopoly, and he was originally called Milburn Pennybags and was created in 1935 by artist Daniel Fox as a caricature of wealthy early 20th century financier J.P. Morgan. We've all probably played Monopoly. I always looked at it as something that Park Avenue was the place I wanted to be. But here we see Boardwalk, Short Line, or Go to Jail, and you realize it's something that resonates with every American adult. And of course, this overprotection, which shows the arm of an armadillo over a turtle. It's a little bit peculiar, but it's also something in some ways that was 10 feet in height. And on the right, Kowloon. Maybe you've dined there. We always used to have my Christmas party there for my office, but it was also something in some ways that was very good 1950s food that has been translated into the 21st century as still very popular. But I think this one is my very favorite. Does anybody recognize what this is? Look on the left. It's Leonardo da Vinci. And Leonardo da Vinci is sculpting, and you see on the left-hand side his male body. So somebody had actually done this wonderful sculpture out of sand, and they've created something of the artist who created some of the best works of art in post-medieval Europe. Well, in a lot of ways, as I mentioned, Revere Beach subtly changed. There was a demographic shift. Revere Beach, which always had entertainment, and of course it was always, now began to see new buildings constructed on the site of not only the boulevard amusements, the frolic, places of entertainment, but now these were things that now have ocean views, parking, and air conditioning. They went the gamut, as I said, of very high quality condominiums, but they also had subsidized and senior living as well. So it was a great example to see within a century how Revere Beach would reinvent itself. And in that instance, Revere Beach stretches 3 miles long, America's first public shore, singing a song of salt and neon ghosts. In that instance, the bandstand now has musicians, and people still use the shelters. You see in some ways that Wonderland entering Revere Beach is a great recount of what it was and what it's become. In some ways, it's America's first public bathing beach. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Please.
When I look at that, you're more familiar with Nantasket.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what was the overlap? Because Nantasket was the same concept in a way.
So Revere Beach was something that you would normally lead transportation. You needed the ferry, the narrow gauge, or even an automobile to get there. Nantasket was all built basically by people going by automobile, unless you lived in Hull. But the whole concept was this was something that was earlier, and it was directly marketed to people in the inner city. So they could get there very quickly and very easily, a nickel train fare. But Nantasket is something in some ways that had the same rides, same hippodrome, same beach, but it was something in a lot of ways that was really marketed to people that would go by automobile. Yes.
Did they rent bathing suits to females as well as males?
Yes. Can you imagine? Males had to wear a top as well as trunks. You couldn't have a bare chest on the beach before 1925. And that was actually an important part of Revere Beach. You know, you think of it, I mean, you saw the picture of the lifeguards. It was something that really did cover their chest. It was a regulation. And that was under the what we call MDC. And the MDC is an important feature who marketed this. So not only did they make the bathing suits, as I mentioned, they washed them, sewed them, and of course, wrung them dry. They didn't have dryers and rented them. They were only a dime. But yes, men and women both had bathing suits. Any other questions?
Do you know if Walt Disney visited Revere Beach?
I don't know. In a lot of ways, Disney World was also something that actually made the Christmas tree shops in some ways create the wonderful facades of these buildings. And I think sometimes when people think of Disney World today, it's terribly expensive. I had an employee that came back to the office and wanted to take a loan. I said, "Why? You just came back from vacation." He said, "That's why I brought my kids to Disney World." It's $20,000 for two children. I said, I would have taken them to Europe instead of Disney World. But yeah, I mean, Walt Disney probably was well aware of it. It was something that was so important. Many people knew about it, not just in Boston, the East Coast. But I'm sure Disney World and Disneyland have really absorbed, in some instances, Coney Island, the Palisades in New Jersey, and Revere Beach. Yes.
Process for gathering all these pictures. You're rather well known locally anyway for writing these nostalgic books and giving these talks. And you're coming up with lots of photographs. You have a pipeline of people, you tell them what you're doing next, and all of a sudden you get on these postcards.
This lecture was asked for a place called Cleveland Circle. I forgot the name of it. I lecture at luxury retirement communities, and my parents were at a place called Fox Hill Village in Westwood. So I gave a few lectures there. They didn't last very long, but the idea is I go to these places with people that are 80 and above, and they remember these places. So Waterstone at Cleveland Circle. So they asked me for a lecture on Revere Beach. I said, I don't do a lecture on Revere Beach. So I decided to do it. So I collect as many photographs as I can. I buy some on eBay. I find things online. I save them, and then I create a PowerPoint lecture. Now, this is something I created about a year ago, but I've changed it 5, 6 times. Right now, I'm doing a lecture on coffee and salt. Now, you think to yourself, coffee and salt, what do you say about them? Well, coffee is something that has a local connection. And if you ever take the Mid-Cape Highway and you see Chase Road, but that was Chase and Sanborn coffee. And it actually was something from the Cape that went to Somerville. So coffee is something that's not only I drink a pot a day, but it's something in some ways I think people might be interested in the history of coffee. I do a thing on chocolate. Salt, when you think of the salt fisheries of Cape Cod, and you think in some ways of the different types of salt, kosher salt, iodized table salt, and even pink Himalayan that I have on my stove that somebody gave me for Christmas. You think, what is salt? But it's such a fascinating topic. I try to do these lectures in such a way that they make people think. So I do lectures on chocolate, molasses, salt. It's the type of a thing that if somebody wants a specific lecture, I read about it and then do it. And it's fun. I do about 175 a year. So, and a lot of it goes to charity. A lot of children in the lower mills of Dorchester attend the library in the afternoon. Their parents work, both parents. So in the afternoon, I pay for tutors to teach them chess or checkers or a math teacher to actually help them with their math. And it's not a lot of money, but it's something in some ways one knows where they are and it's safe. So it's a kind of fun thing to do. Yes.
Yeah, my father was born in 1931. He lived in Natick.
You must have been a change of life, baby.
And when he was young, they would go drive from Natick, and he went back over time, him and my mother in the eighties and nineties, when his kids grew up, myself, my brother and sister, they would go back on Sundays and those bandstands would have live music.
Yes, I mean, it's fun. It was free. It was entertainment, and there were people. I mean, it's a nice thing to walk and enjoy the mise en scène. I mean, what it is. And I think in a lot of ways, Revere Beach was sometimes the playground of Bostonians.
In 2019, my son was working in Boston. He had an apartment on Revere Beach, just north of the police barracks.
Yes,
state
yes.
Police. And the nice feature of the apartment was, he was on the first floor and there was parking under. So it was actually on the second floor, and that section is all grass. There wasn't any buildings in front of him, so he had a clear view. And we used to go and visit and stay over, and we walked the strip. And unfortunately, his company shut down, so he transferred. He lives in Texas,
Oh my.
but he did like living there.
Well, I think in a lot of ways, I had this great uncle, and he had a house in Port Pines that faced the ocean. They were beautiful houses. The Rotary was there, and the General Edwards Inn was there. So we would dine there and come back to the house, and he would always complain. They were beautiful houses on the ocean, but they flooded every winter. So this basement would have a bathing facility, 2 to 3 feet of water. So I'd say to myself as a child, why would you build on swampland? Because it really is behind those houses, swampland. But in a lot of ways, I think, ocean views are wonderful. But so long as they don't have hurricanes or flooding, fantastic. But that's a nice story. I think sometimes the views can be well worth it if you're on the second floor. Any other questions? Well, thank you for coming to the Austville Village Library.
Thank you.